As the facts emerge in exactly what happened in Monday's shooting at a small private Christian grade school in Nashville by an apparent transgender female-to-male shooter who had attended the school in her younger years, there are several oddities or anomalies in play. According to some analysis, this is only the 5th female school shooting, or even the 5th female mass shooting in general in U.S. history. Given the transgender identity, it's unclear what role, if any, hormones or other related treatment may have played. On Tuesday, the police chief mentioned that the shooter suffered from an emotional disorder for which she was receiving medical care.
She was under care, doctor's care, for an emotional disorder.
More odd still, there's finally a case in which otherwise hesitant media are now perfectly willing to call a woman a woman. The AP, the New York Times, CNN, and more not affirming the shooter's gender identity, at least in Monday's reporting. That could be an intentional effort to divorce this story from transgender ideology, or, in fairness, it could just be because the police chief himself was somewhat confused about the shooter's gender during his Monday press conference.
Did she identify as a transgender man or woman?
Woman.
So maybe they were just listening to the chief. Otherwise, I think they'd eagerly categorize this story within the trend in which it clearly fits. Another angry white male strikes again. White male in a red hat, in fact. So case closed. Another oddity is this is a very rare case of a pistol-braced mass shooting, or at least the shooter was carrying one, a pistol-braced AR, though based on the surveillance footage, it does look like she used this presumably 9mm Kel-Tec Sub 2000 to actually commit the shootings. Still, even the presence of a braced gun in a mass shooting like this is an almost never event. The only other case I can recall is the Boulder grocery store shooting in 2021. And remember, this is exactly the sort of braced configuration that the ATF is now trying to ban retroactively, with everyone who owns them required to register them, modify them with 16-inch barrels, or become an insta-felon on June 1st. In fact, a hearing on the bill seeking to stop the ATF's overreach scheduled for Tuesday was delayed, with Judiciary Committee Chairman Jim Jordan citing expected Democrat politicization based on the shooting as the reason. And I suppose I wouldn't call it an oddity or an anomaly necessarily, really just more of a refreshing contrast to the similar event that happened in Uvalde, Texas last year. But in multiple perspectives of police body cam footage released Tuesday morning, we can see an urgent, brave, and tactically sound response that eliminated the threat in the school within about 3 minutes after police arrival on the scene. A hurried rush to the shooter and some prompt reassignment surgery, half her face being reassigned out the window. As admirable as that police response was, of course, it's also an unfortunate demonstration that even a nearly flawless police response is still insufficient when a psychopath like this is not immediately confronted upon arrival. And that lack of an initial confrontation is, of course, a crucial piece of the shooter's intent, not just by the inference that an easy target would be the preference of someone planning this sort of attack, which this shooter clearly did based on the discovery of a manifesto that included mapping of the school.
We have a manifesto, we have some writings that we're going over, we have a map drawn out of how this was all going to take place.
And based on investigators' preliminary belief that there were transgender ideological reasons for selecting this target.
Is there any reason to believe that how she identifies has any motive for targeting the school?
There is some theory to that.
But we can tell the lack of confrontation is part of the shooter's intent based on the shooter's own explicit statements. As odd as this shooting may seem, and maybe you say it's not actually odd at all, given a selection of similar recent events, but regardless, much more than ideology, there is something else that these shooters commonly share: their target selection. We don't have to theorize about why this shooter strategically chose this spot. It is the most important momentary mention the police have provided so far. This shooter selected this spot after considering other potential targets and determining those other options were, quote, too secure.
There was another location that was mentioned, but because of a threat assessment by the suspect and too much security, they decided not to.
And indeed, the Covenant School, the target this shooter chose, had no armed resource officer on campus at the time. As of now, unclear if they did at any time. And since it was a private school, the facility also did not employ anybody from the Nashville Police Department to provide armed security. Now, I don't raise this point to blame the school, of course. We don't yet know all the details of their security plan. We don't know their budget or their resources. It remains possible that they had a person who was supposed to intervene in this sort of event, but maybe that person was away at the time, or maybe the school just wasn't in position to hire somebody for that sort of role. Whatever the circumstances that explain why this target was soft, the fact of the matter remains it was soft. And unless the police chief is fully making it up and lying, there is documentation from the shooter herself explicitly saying she chose this site because it's soft. They don't even make us do the hard part of investigating, piecing together clues to crack a case. For all the decency they obviously lack, these shooters somehow maintain enough to tell us exactly why they pick the targets that they do. These are psychopaths looking to victimize the helpless, and so they seek helplessness. And I say they, not for the gender inclusionary reasons this case supposedly demands, though of course I wouldn't want to attract the ire of USA Today's Pulitzer Prize-winning pronoun checker. I say it because it's the perfectly appropriate plural term. Time after time, these mass shooters tell us, hey, thanks for the gun-free zone. It was a big assist to my plot. When the police chief mentioned a manifesto and other writings that describe intentionally targeting helplessness, I immediately thought of the Buffalo grocery store shooting last year because I read that manifesto to try to understand the mindset of people who commit this sort of attack. That shooter provided an itemized list of strategies for his success, which included choosing a target in New York State due to restrictive concealed carry laws lessening the likelihood of someone stopping him. He also chose to attack in New York State because of an assault weapons ban and a ban on magazines over 10 rounds, also lowering the likelihood of a civilian confronting him with decent firepower. Then he mocked how easy it was to acquire an AR in New York State and illegally modify it to suit his purposes anyway. And you'd think it'd be uncommon to hear criminals so openly describe their strategies and intent, but in this context, it's not at all. They tell us all the time. Dylan Roof, the 2015 Charleston church shooter, according to his friend, originally planned to target the College of Charleston, but decided he couldn't get into the school because of security, advertised on the college's website as armored officers carrying rifles, shotguns, or handguns, and trained for active shooter response. And the church wasn't just a soft target in practice, it was a soft target by law, at least partially. South Carolina law prohibits concealed carry at churches unless a church official gives express permission to the carrier. Elliot Rodger, the 2014 Isla Vista shooter, also explained his reasoning in a manifesto. In strategizing for his attack, he thought about locations and times to minimize police presence, fearing he'd be too quickly neutralized by those damnable cops. 2 years prior, in 2012, before James Holmes attacked an Aurora, Colorado showing of The Dark Knight Rises, he wrote in his diary about his choice of venue, originally considering an airport, but deciding against it because of, quote, substantial security. There were 7 theaters showing the Batman movie in the Aurora area that night. James Holmes selected the only one that banned the permitted carry of handguns. These are just a sample of the cases where the shooter explicitly stated that selecting a soft target was strategically important, but by the data, we can infer that's the strategy for the others too, even if they don't say it outright. An analysis from John Lott at the Crime Prevention Research Center found that 94% of mass public shootings from 1950 through the first half of 2019 happened in gun-free zones, as in places that prohibit civilian carry. A stat that sounds high, and any claim that's skewed certainly deserves some scrutiny, but even the Washington Post fact-checker assessed the claim and found that, yeah, using the same methodology in a condensed time window of 2009 to 2016, 86% of mass public shootings happened in gun-free zones. Of course, the gun control organization Everytown counters with its own analysis to say, no, only 10% of mass shootings happen in gun-free zones. So why the discrepancy? Well, because every town counts mass shootings in homes or domestic settings, which tend to skew toward drug or other gang-related disputes, and of course, don't fit the concept of mass shooting in the publicly understood sense. Every town acknowledges 63% of their data are mass shootings in private homes. Mass shootings don't happen at home. And of course, no home is a gun-free zone, not even in California or New York yet, at least. So of course you can just drown out the reality if you lump in a bunch of noise that has no reason for inclusion. It's amazing how inconvenient numbers get smaller if you just start counting a bunch of other stuff that shouldn't. And obviously, the grabbers will insist that all other factors are irrelevant. It's not the shooter, it's not the security, it's not the mental illness. Of course, it's not even the drag queens, says Chasten Buttigieg, our first transportation gentleman, with very unfortunate premature confidence considering it kind of was a drag queen in this case, or at least the closely related inverse, a chick who dresses as a guy. Fine, it's not the drag kings, says Chasten. It's the guns. Well, no. It's the opposite there, too. It's quite literally the lack of guns, actually. Not according to me, just a guy who enjoys them and understands the philosophical basis on which they are a protected right in this country, but according to the shooters themselves. Because invariably, at least where we have a record of their thoughts, these shooters are saying, I am picking this spot where nobody can fight back. And then the supposedly obvious, compassionate political response we're all supposed to embrace is let's accommodate them further and make sure that nobody can fight back, or at least make it much harder to do. I'm not just listening to my own hobby enjoyment or my politics here. I'm listening to the shooters themselves. Why would we follow their preferences? Why would we accommodate their strategies? Why would we make it easier for them and harder for us? And of course, I remain open to the evidence. I look forward to reading the writings of the other mass shooters who said, I specifically chose this spot because of the armed guards and because every civilian inside was packing. That's how badass I am. I haven't heard that story yet, but I will wait for it. And even more than the story, I look forward to watching the surveillance video of the shooter actually trying it. Because if you thought the body cam footage in this case was good, the video is even better when she gets one warning before the guard immediately drops her after popping out of that Honda Fit with 2 rifles in the first place. Probably should have been shot on the spot just for driving it at all, actually. If you're trying to be a man, this is not a convincing look. Now, of course, there are resource needs, there are training needs, there are logistical needs of all sorts to make that version of the story the reality next time. Granted, easier said than done, but I will certainly take solutions aimed in that direction over let's listen to what the shooters say we should do. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below and especially over on Gab. That is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to coming out and chatting my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it. Goodbye.